All right, ladies and gentlemen, with your indulgence, we'll get started. This is the last of the plenary sessions today. I won't take very long, but I do want to say a few words to you about where we go from here. So the title of this is The Way Forward, What's Next? In the next couple of minutes, I want to try and frame what's been happening within anthropology, sketch where we are, why we are where we are, and where we need to go from here. In the process, I hope you'll get some idea of what we've been up to in the Career Readiness Commission. And I also hope at the end of it all that you'll decide to join us in what I think is probably the most important change that's happening with and to anthropology in our lifetimes. That might, right? So let me talk a little bit about the rise of practice in anthropology. Today, our discipline is being transformed, and the driver for this is the growth of anthropological practice. And by practice, I mean simply anthropology done outside the walls of the university, largely but not entirely by degree-holding anthropologists who are not full-time academics. Practice, simply put, is the application of anthropology to issues of societal concern. Practice deals in very direct ways with humanity's likely futures, with issues, concerns, and opportunities of importance for large numbers of people here and across the globe. Practice has now become the norm for most of our anthropology graduates, and it has been for some time. Practice is not simply integral to anthropology's future, but it is likely to be the main determinant of that future. But as we know, many today still think of anthropology as a quintessentially academic discipline. Originally, it had a very strong practical and applied character, and this is well documented, but it tends to be forgotten. Of particular note were the activities of anthropologists during the Great Depression, during the Second World War, and afterwards with various international development efforts. But then two things happened, which were to have a profound effect on our discipline. One was the rapid expansion and growth of universities, and the second, of course, was the Vietnam War. Anthropology was a relative newcomer to the university, and a lot of effort went into claiming a place there and establishing a reputation. Today, we'd probably call this branding. The brand chosen, however, had the unfortunate effect of distancing anthropology from many of society's biggest concerns. Anthropologists burnished their image as the curators of the exotic and the strange, the guys who'd been to places others had never heard of, spoke strange languages, and who could talk knowledgeably of practices and behaviors that others could hardly imagine. But we weren't just exotics, we were mavericks. We'd understood, intuitively perhaps, what folks say about dog sled teams, that only the lead dog and the maverick get a real view. And so we became the folks who invoked what came to be known as the Pango principle in all of our meetings. This is where the anthropologist stands up and goes, well, excuse me, I don't agree. In my village, they didn't do it that way. And that sort of tended to stop the conversation, and it prevented us in many ways from building consensus with other people. At the same time, we needed to make our bones academically. And so our earlier interest in application kind of evaporated as departments focused on becoming more scholarly. The emphasis turned to matters like theory, peer review, publication, and building out new programs. Then came Vietnam. In the United States, particularly in the wake of the Camelot and the Thailand controversies, work for outside organizations of practically any kind was deemed by the academy to be suspect and unethical. Applied anthropology, and the term was almost always put in scare quotes, was condemned as anthropology light, theoretically impoverished, mere social work in the view of many of our senior scholars. Those who engaged in such work were intellectually second-rate, in thrall to the highest bidder, and ethically challenged. In a word, they were unworthy. The dominance of the academy and the othering of practice within it had clear and important consequences. Because of its preoccupation with the remote and the exotic, and its skittishness about any involvement in what might be termed the affairs of the real world, anthropology effectively ceded the ground to other disciplines in key areas of concern. One of these was my own, international development, which became dominated, as we all know, by economics. Another was the area of diplomacy and international relations. In both cases, we failed to develop any real understanding of power or of large organizations. And this has severely constrained us through the years, despite people like Mary Douglas pointing out to us how essential large institutions are for modern life and how much of our thinking they do for us. Academic expansion slowed eventually, but departments continued to provide and produce large numbers of graduate degree holders. And so increasing numbers of anthropology graduates began to seek non-academic work in government, in industry, and in the nonprofit world. At the same time, of course, the world's need for social knowledge continued to increase. In 1986, John Van Willigen accurately predicted our future when he wrote this. He said, "It appears unlikely that large numbers of anthropologists entering the job market as practicing anthropologists now will take academic jobs in the future. They will not return because there will not be jobs for them. Their salary expectations cannot be met, and they just do not want to." So where we are today, for most of our graduates, as I said, practice is now the default option. The opportunities presented by practice are increasingly attractive to students. A non-academic career is no longer seen as a consolation prize for those without a university appointment. Practitioners now outnumber university-based anthropologists by considerable numbers. Practitioners, almost irrespective of the sector they work in, tend to share four quite distinct value orientations which separate them, to some degree at least, from their academically based colleagues. The first is that they are focused on results. For practitioners, what you know is important, but more important is what you can do with what you know. Secondly, the work of practitioners is not defined or evaluated by peers in most cases, but by clients. Third, in their jobs, practitioners usually work collaboratively with diverse others to co-think and co-create. And finally, practitioners are almost always involved in efforts to produce change and improvement. Far from being detached observers commenting on the scene, practitioners are an integral part of it with skin in the game. Now, although the academy and the world of practice may seem far apart, they are actually simply different locations within a single social field, interconnected and interdependent in an increasing number of ways. Practice generates energy improvement and discovery. But despite the fact that it is from the world of practice that these things are emerging, very little of this is finding its way back into the academy in the form of recognition, training, or acceptance. So, what have we learned so far from the experience of practice? Today, we have a two-pronged problem in anthropology. One problem is that our academic training, in all but a few cases, underprepares our graduates for the demands of the extramural world. The second related problem is that of a general lack of connection between practice and a discipline which appears much of the time to not care very much about it. Let's look at training first. And here the thing to note is what I just put up on the board. We have no common model or set of standards for training anthropologists. We never have had. As someone once remarked, we're not really a discipline. Instead, we're a craft with lodges scattered about the country. Think of it as a kind of a distributed Hogwarts. I'm serious. Depending on where you go to learn your craft, you're going to be very differently trained. Some of us get trained by Gandalf, others by Merlin, but you might, for all you know, get trained by Severus Snape or Glinda the Good Witch. Nor do we appear to have any real plan to change this. 40 years ago, James Spradley said this about our discipline. He said, "We are doing all of this work in anthropology in a planless sort of way, with no understanding or knowledge of how we are distributing manpower in anthropology, and therefore necessarily no understanding of how we should distribute our efforts, except through rarely voiced but deep prejudices that the best schools should concern themselves with the most esoteric work in the most ivory tower manner." This lack of coherence conceals an even deeper problem, in my opinion. In most of our programs, we're not really training anthropology students to actually be able to do anything. The ability to conduct research might be considered a thing, but not all of our programs even teach methods. Fewer still teach courses in anthropological practice and application. In other words, what to do with what you find out using the methods. Students can go through an entire degree program and never meet a practitioner. Instead, our students are taught to be critical observers of things that other people do. They get good, as one of my development colleagues observed, at telling people all of the different ways that the chair is broken, but they have very little to say about how to fix the chair. In consequence, our graduate students are, by and large, poorly prepared to make their way in the marketplace, and once there, to demonstrate to others how useful anthropology can be. It is a tribute to the intelligence and the motivation of our graduates, including most of you here today, that they have done as well as they have under the circumstances. In their hands, anthropology can be and is a very powerful tool, but most of them have had to learn to use that tool pretty much on their own. So let's talk now about where the path might lead us from now on into the future, assuming that is that we want a different future. As family therapists are fond of saying to people, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. And that is, in the commission, we all believe that one way or another, what we've gotten so far isn't really quite good enough. So if we want different outcomes from how anthropology presents itself in the world, then we will need to change the way in which anthropologists are trained. Our primary long-term need, in my view, is that of adding a professional arm to our discipline. Not to challenge the core discipline at all, but to enhance and extend it and to build its capabilities. A discipline is a lens. It's a way of looking at the world and making meaning. A discipline generates knowledge, but the utility of that knowledge is not necessarily either assumed or sought. Knowledge for its own sake is okay in most cases. A profession, in contrast, seeks to use what it knows. While a discipline talks mainly to itself, a profession talks to others about problems and issues of common concern. So while a discipline generates knowledge, a profession puts it to use. Developing a professional arm will not threaten the core of our discipline. It will enhance and extend it. It is not difficult to do this. We have the example of several other disciplines that are very successful, but it does require a sufficient amount of political will. The key, in my view, to developing professional capabilities within our discipline involves bringing the experience of practice into the academy and then into the training of our students. Practice, if you think about it, in essence, is really field work. That's what it is. The experiences of practitioners, their accomplishments, lessons learned, thick descriptions of the workplace and how it operates, together with early recognition of both warnings and opportunities, all of this is the stuff of which disciplinary advance is usually constructed. And most of this has been absent from the academic curriculum so far. Developing professional capabilities among our students is the only real way to increase anthropology's contribution to and impact on today's global issues. Overcoming our reluctance to move beyond theory to practice is something we should have done decades ago. And Kamari Clark put it this way. She said, "The compartmentalization between theory and praxis is false and has no place in the context of an unfurling new world order in whose presence anthropology has a far from public face and risks becoming divided between those in ivory towers and those who are exiled from academia because of the work that they do." We can always remain on the sidelines as critics, of course, talking mainly to ourselves. As folks in the Middle East used to say, the dogs bark, but the caravan moves on. The need for and the recognition of social knowledge is growing, and so are the opportunities for practicing anthropologists. The longer that we fail to actively promote our discipline in the public sphere, the more likelihood there will be that others will fill in that space and appropriate both our methods and our role. If only they would listen to us is a refrain heard from anthropologists in the faculty lounges across the country. Well, here's a newsflash. People don't listen to us for the simple reason that not enough of us are saying useful things, and not usually in ways that help people solve problems. The activities of anthropologists, however clever and insightful they may seem to be to us, simply do not show up on radar screens for most of the rest of the world. As Ralph Bishop once remarked, Margaret Mead dead is better journalistic copy than most living anthropologists. So what is next? I've been waiting for years, by the way, to use that line. So what's ahead for the commission? To repeat, if we want different outcomes from anthropology, we need to change the way anthropologists are trained. This is the reason that Elizabeth set up the commission. And it's the reason I agreed to work with her on it. The commission is unusual in several respects. We are not really a formal organization. We're more of an affinity group of volunteers. We're not controlled by or beholden to any other academic or professional group. We believe that keeping practice and the experience of practitioners at the center of what we do is the way to stay focused, relevant, and strategic. Our working approach in the past year has been largely a form of rapid assessment, as you know, as a way of identifying and exploring some of the biggest issues, questions, and opportunities relating to how practitioners work in the world and what this means for training within the discipline. For example, we've looked at gaps in training, what sorts of materials are available for students, how academic programs have tried to incorporate practice and application into their curriculum, and a bunch of other things. We've investigated what some of the specific sectoral characteristics are for places that practitioners work. We're working now on identifying ways of helping build a networked community of practice, and also looking at effective narratives that practitioners can use to explain anthropology to employers, clients, and the general public. We did not set out to provide definitive academic studies of these issues, but rather to chart some of the overall topography for each of them, both as a way to focus problem solving of the moment and as a way to identify needed work for the future. All of this has given us a considerable insight into some of the issues and challenges that will help us frame and drive our work in the coming year. So based on what we've learned so far, here are 5 things that we think are important to address in the future. The first is building better capacity in instructors and departments for better preparation. Materials, frameworks, and connections are all part of the promotion of a professional arm for the discipline, but all of this and more depends on the instructors within our universities, those who mentor, teach, and guide future anthropologists, both academics and practitioners. We want to help instructors build their own capacity to teach, mentor, and advise those students. We will look, for example, for partnerships and linkages of various kinds with selected individuals and departments in order to work with them to assess needs, develop alternative responses to those needs, and support this with training and pedagogic material. Secondly, we will work on developing professional components for training. We all agree that good anthropological practice is going to have to be, first and foremost, good anthropology. But many of the skills that practitioners say are needed for success are not being taught in many of our programs, or not in ways which match the requirements of the workplace. What would a curriculum look like that actually set out to prepare its graduates for innovative application of the discipline? We will be engaged in discussion with our partners and colleagues in the coming months to identify the key components of such a curriculum and materials to support it. We do not see this as a threat or a challenge to existing programs, not at all, but rather as a resource from which they may draw as their inclinations and their circumstances permit. 3, getting practitioners better connected with one another and with the academy. We intend to explore how best to develop a true community of practice among those working outside the university and how to connect them in synergistic ways with the academy itself. We would like to open a conversation with our colleagues on how exactly to do this, how to connect practitioners in ways which enable networking for mentoring, professional development, problem solving, and exchange of information. Number 4, we want to recognize and encourage a literature of practice. If practice is today's fieldwork, then accounts of practice can feed the discipline in the same way that classical ethnographies did, helping to inform and build our profession. One of our goals, therefore, is to promote and encourage a literature of practice, accounts written by practitioners about their work. There is already a considerable corpus of practice literature available, but we need more. We will be actively looking for ways to encourage and disseminate the experiences of practice in the future. And finally, we want to develop ways to increase and enhance our public presence and our public voice. Anthropology, whether as an academic discipline or as a form of professional practice, is unfamiliar to most of the public. Our training programs do little, it appears, to help students understand how to explain who they are and what they do, and even less to help them advocate for anthropology in the workplace. We've been working with colleagues to elicit and construct a coherent set of anthropology narratives, which can be used to introduce ourselves to others, to frame our work, and to explain and illuminate the significance of our findings. We believe that having a persuasive and coherent narrative about their discipline and its strengths will help students enter, negotiate, and succeed in the workplace. So let me finish. Years ago, James Peacock, one of the former presidents of the AAA, set out 3 possible futures for anthropology. I think many of you are familiar with this. One scenario had us stagnating and eventually disappearing. The second had us continuing very much as before. The third, most hopeful scenario imagined us attaining what Abraham Maslow might have termed self-actualization, the realization of our full potential. The good news, of course, is that we have not disappeared. The bad news, of course, is that we have made little progress, if any, towards self-actualization. Instead, we've chosen to remain more or less where we've always been. My friend Don Podget once described academic anthropologists today as resembling a bunch of movie zombies, wandering about fairly aimlessly and once in a while managing to bite someone and turn them into a zombie too. It's a very interesting image. And if you don't know Dan, you should get to know him. He's an interesting guy, and with more than a grain of truth to it. I am not referring to practitioners here who in many ways are on the cutting edge of the discipline, developing new theories, new methods, exploring new areas. But most of this is going on, as I've said, without much recognition, understanding, or even awareness on the part of some of those inside the academy. Nothing in our present situation will change unless we make it change. The Commission knows that the transformation of our discipline will take time and a great deal of effort. But as the political journalist I.F. Stone reminded us, if you expect to see the results of what you're working on during your own lifetime, you just haven't picked a big enough problem. So, to conclude, anthropology, its core values, its methods, is going to be enormously helpful and valuable to humankind as we finally begin to take seriously the resolution of the global grand challenges which we now face. Because if one definition of intelligence is the ability to make finer and finer discriminations that really matter, then anthropology makes us smarter. And smart people, as we all know, are much better at their jobs. Smart people are more interesting to be with. Smart people are more fun. In other words, they're just the kinds of folks that you would want helping the rest of us save the world. Thank you very much. Elizabeth says I have to answer questions now. Which I will.
Any comments, questions? Yes.
This is me setting up the Career Readiness Commission, but if people want to get involved, how should they get involved in the Career Readiness Commission?
Okay, very, very good question and a simple answer. There is a website. You have all those materials on the table out there, have the website printed on them. Elizabeth had this on hers. It's going to be sent to each of you. Go on the website and there is a registration box form that you can fill out, and you will then automatically be put on the list for future mailings. And that will include things like our newsletter and announcements of our Zoom get-togethers, where you can now start to participate. And you can also write individually to either me or to Elizabeth or anybody else, actually, including the lady who asked the question, Jennifer, there, because she's a member of our group too, and ask specific questions about things. There's a lot of material available on the website. There's a lot of different ideas. We've only sort of scratched the surface here, but we do need help going forward. This is, we finished a year of sort of preliminary investigation. We've figured out what some, not all, of the big issues are. We now need to work with like-minded, smart others to figure out, okay, so what do we do now? How do we do this? Some things are pretty clear, other things less so. So, thank you.
Something I've been very interested in my career in academic anthropology is how do you prevent. Is that better?
Yeah.
How do we hire faculty that don't create ideologues in the classroom? How do we hire faculty? I have experience with this. I hired 54 faculty at a national online university to teach anthropology and sociology. And many of the people I interviewed and many of my colleagues at other universities and colleges that I've worked at turn out to be more than an advocate for social issues. They turn out to be ideologues. And many of their students, your comment about how students become enriched by critical inquiry, that's absolutely correct in my experience as well. But the reason for that is that many of the faculty hire like-minded ideologues. Chairs do it, department deans do it, provosts do it. I mean, I've seen this for a number of years. This is not something recent. This has been going on for quite some time. And people talk about diversity in universities today with a fairly limited perspective. And I consider, for example, how many family people are there in anthropology positions at universities and colleges in America? Not a lot. And there are reasons for that. But more so than that, how do we hire people who don't set out to create student ideologues, but they create students who are aware of social justice, they're aware of iniquities and disparities in our culture, but they're open-minded also to changing these things.
Well, yeah, so as I have someone would have said, if you get a question you think you can answer before the end of the afternoon, you haven't picked a big enough question. I mean, that's a big one. Let me offer just a few real quick observations. You've been on plenty of search committees, and so have I, and so have many of the people in the room. It's a Shakespearean process, isn't it? I mean, it's you could write tomes about it, and we won't get into all of the stuff. But I think that we take a tip from the HR people and say, well, the only real indicator of future performance is past performance. And although it's very hard with a fresh graduate who may not have a whole lot of experience, but they've got experience, believe me, they've been TAs or RAs, they've been involved. And search committees often don't take the time to look into what exactly these people have been like as colleagues, for example, as teachers, or as researchers, or in our case, as practitioners. We're trying to hire, you're talking about people that are ideologically based. I suppose you could consider practice a form of ideology, and Lord knows we've tried to hire practitioners into anthropology departments over and over again, and in some cases have succeeded, but it takes a lot of hard work to do that. And a lot of persuading of other faculty members, a lot of demonstrating, a lot of what I suppose you might call translational research on our part, showing how somebody's supposedly practice-oriented program was actually very scholarly in its, if you have to do that, it's kind of what Jillian was talking about. Not exactly compromising, but making sure you acknowledge the concerns of your colleagues when they are hiring people. So with practice, it's always been my task to explain how something that looks like it has no relationship to traditional academic scholarly anthropology actually does. And I've been successful on a few occasions, but unsuccessful on others. How you get into the ideological thing, I really don't know. A shout out to Tim, for example. Fordham, as you know, is a Jesuit institution. I am an admirer of Jesuit education, not because I am a Catholic, I am not, but because their mission, and it is very clearly stated, is the development of leadership for social justice. Now, what they mean by that and what other people may mean by that are probably two very different things, and I don't want to get into that, but they put it on their website. And so I kind of like that. But I do see the problem that you're evoking, and I do not know how to deal with it. I really don't. I wish I did. Sometimes they have easy answers, and I don't today. I'm sorry.
You run around here.
So I have a question, because as we talk about practice and ensuring that faculty are equipped in order to teach practice, how do we think about also ensuring that the practice experience of those faculty members is sufficiently up to date? And I say that because, I've encountered faculty who view themselves as practitioners, but a lot of their work has been a long time in the past. And some of the perspectives they share is not relevant for the current time period. Even terminology that they use is outdated or antiquated. So as the commission thinks about this, how are they envisioning ensuring that practicing anthropologists in the walls of academia are in fact up to date?
That's an excellent question. And I don't have a clear answer, but I have possibly a slightly better answer than I did for the last question. Yes, it's a problem. And I mean, I'm a really good example. I'm 78 years old. And I've been, a practitioner for, well, most of my life, but it's, as the years go by, right? So the USAID and the World Bank that I worked for, the UN that I worked for, they're not the same today. Although I would maintain that in many respects, fundamental ones, they are exactly the same. But that's a whole other issue. I think that I would go back to what I said and what I think Elizabeth has said. We're trying to keep this commission practitioner focused, which means focused on the here and the now, the experience of people now in the workplace, not 30 years ago. And so we are deriving data from current practitioners and trying to figure out what does that mean. And I think if we are successful at doing what I recommended that we do, which is trying to bring practice more fully and the experience of practitioners more fully into the academy, we will overcome that problem to an extent. It won't be perfect, but it'll be I hope, Tim, you're being asked for the mic again.
I love what you're saying, and I think what Fordham is doing and bringing in someone like Matt Arts is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Because bringing in Matt, he's a practitioner in today's world right now,
Yep.
and bringing him into the walls of academia is a perfect example.
Yeah. And we all know, which is back to this question about how difficult it is to hire practitioners in, but in they must come one way or another. Again, not to challenge people, but to sort of refresh and reinvigorate. It is a form of fieldwork. And what's going on out there right now is of enormous importance to the future of our discipline, and most of our more scholarly operations, forgive me, but I mean, they are simply not dealing with it in any kind of way. And it's because they don't have people who have that kind of experience.
I'd like to chime in because Autumn brings up a very good point. This is not just an issue for anthropologists. It's also an issue for marketers. I teach
Yeah.
advertising. So currently, I've worked at BBDO, but I've been out 10 years. So yeah, the world is changing very fast. So yes, other academics too, we get invited, and we're in contact with agencies like Ogilvy that bring us in for a week, and we're learning, we tag along, we go to these workshops to learn new techniques, and we're reading up on stuff all the time. So yes, that's a constant problem in academia, not just anthropologists, but I think that you also speak to the attitude of some academics who think they know it all, and they kind of sit back on their laurels and can relax. And no, you're always having to update yourself, keep current on everything, whether anthropology or advertising, marketing, and so forth. So very good point.
The laurels are getting a little dry and wilted. When Elizabeth and I were setting up these surveys to work on things, we did work with a number of senior academics. We had them as part of the conversation. And I have to say, and I'll say it because there are none of them in the room today, they were the ones that generally said things like, oh, well, we've already done that. We don't need to go over that again. You remember those things? And I mean, they were referring to 30-year-old studies. And we were very, I think, polite and said, well, we need to get some newer data in here. I'm sorry, I'm taking up too much time. Please.
No, you're fine. Ooh,
There you go.
you're fine. So I just wanted to bring it back to something that you mentioned about making practical anthropology another branch of the field. Do you think that doing that will jeopardize the other subfields or make them feel threatened in a way? Because as you established, they deem the practical anthropology unworthy or secondary. But they are also aware that if they did add it and put it into curriculum, it would maybe not attract the freshmen that enter, but as the students go on and realize that the practical side is more rational, it would appeal to them more and pull them away from the other subfields.
Yeah, that's a good question and a valid observation. I think there is a risk of all of that, but I think we know that there will be a risk, and I think we can take steps to mitigate it or hopefully avoid it altogether. I have stressed in everything I've ever written and said that these are complementary sides to anthropology. They are not antagonistic. They should not be viewed that way. And I believe that because I think one doesn't function very well without the other. You know, at the risk of being one of those old-fashioned guys, I mean, Irv Chambers said this to us years and years ago. He said, hey, applied anthropology is good anthropology. It has to be. So it has to be disciplinarily grounded. But the idea that you develop a professional arm is not a new thing. It's new to anthropologists because they've never thought about it that way. But ask any psychologist, ask any engineer, ask any lawyer, ask any doctor, okay? These are all disciplines that developed very early on a professional arm, and there is absolutely no problem. Well, I'm sorry, we all know too much about engineering and psychology to say there's no problem, but there are very few problems of moving back and forth. It is expected that people with degrees in psychology mostly find themselves out on the street practicing. Engineers likewise, doctors likewise. Some go into universities and become sort of theoreticians, but most people don't. Does it threaten the core discipline? Possibly, but I don't think so. And I think it will sell itself and it will not transform the entire discipline. There will always be elite universities that are rich enough and secure enough to do whatever the heck they want. And they will go their merry way. But any other university or college worth its salt is going to start asking itself, if it hasn't already, where do our graduates go? And what do they do? And it's not just about getting a job. It's about being successful in that job and being the kind of alumni that you can be proud of and that are able in the fullness of time to give back to the university. And anthropology can be those kinds of people. So I don't think it's going to threaten people if we do this in the right way. But I agree with you. There's a delicate conversation to have. And not everybody will be a taker. Not every university will choose to become more professional. Some will never do it. That's fine. It's a question in the end of what you think you're doing with America's young folks.
On that note, I'd also like to expand on this a little bit and take it outside of, do you feel there can be more done that's outside of the workplace and outside of university spectrums? Because what you have described is that anthropology is not just a discipline, it's a craft, it's a change of mind, it's a adapting to new environments and using those skills in new ways. I like to say that as not necessarily reactionary. I like to use the reference or the comparisons of reactionary versus preventative. And do you think we could do something involved with like K through 12 schools, especially with this rapid changing world with overstimulus and multimedia, where we can use this commission in further places rather than just like workplace and university?
I do. And I wish I had time to go into all of that because I feel rather strongly about it. I was, some of you know this, most of you don't. I was not trained in the United States. I'm not a four-field anthropologist. I chose not to be. I looked at it and said, not for me. I went to Great Britain and I have a PhD from the University of Sussex and I've been teaching at Cambridge University. I'm an American and I am fully aware of American anthropology. In Britain, there has been an enormous controversy that started 40, 50 years ago with Sir Edmund Leach, who some of you know about kinship systems of Highland Burma, classic ethnography, who wrote an article, an op-ed for the London Times, thundering that anthropology must never and should never and will never be taught in British high schools. And he gave a long, convoluted intellectual set of reasons for why that would be. We've never had that kind of thing in the United States, but it's very clear, isn't it, that the large anthropology discipline, writ large, is not very interested in this. And it should be, because by the time folks get into their first year in college, there's a lot of ground to be made up. And so I would very much like to see, if you want to call them practitioners, I think that might be the best thing, going into K through 12 education as anthropologists and teaching about the rest of the world, because it just doesn't happen. And I live in Indiana, which is a very nice state in many respects, but I have had my moments when I've been listening to my students and I realize they're smart as hell. People used to say to me, are the students at Purdue as smart as they are at Cambridge? I said, every bit as smart, but they're just a bit culturally deprived. They don't know a lot about the rest of the world. And that's not everybody. There are people in this room that know far more than I do about some things, and they come from Indiana too, or did. But what I'm trying to say is that, yes, exposing people to a wider view of the world starts, it seems to me, in kindergarten. And anthropology needs to be leading that, and we are not. It's one more example of how we have abandoned the ground to other people. And so, yeah. Good question. Thank you.
Question here and then another follow-up question here.
Just piggybacking on the topic of the practicing arm, the practical arm, I just want to note for the crowd that archaeology went through that process. The practical side, the cultural resources management side, went through that sort of division of academic and practicing a number of years ago. And I have to tell you, it for me, going through that process, as it was emerging, a divergence of the field, there were consequences. There were absolutely consequences to reputation, to funding, to opportunity. But I'm extremely hopeful with the help of the commission and a reconfiguration of our mindset that the experiences I had that sort of pushed me out of the field are not going to repeat themselves, that we have better resources to show the way in the practicing field. So I'm very excited to see what's coming, what's possible. But there's a little note of caution from the history of cultural resource management and federal compliance. What can happen when you do diverge? Wondering about your comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And something I was saying earlier, when people have big problems, one of the first things I say to people is, well, look around and see who else has had that problem and what did they do about it and what happened as a result of what they did, and learn from that. So these kinds of experiences, what you're describing, and not having been trained as an archaeologist and not having a whole lot to do with it, I don't know much about that, but I've heard things, right? And, in my various departments about that. I think that would be something we would need to pay a lot of attention to and learn the lessons. They say, well, history may not repeat, but it rhymes. And so we would do well to understand how that might play out. Yeah. Thank you.
My comment is in relation to K through 12, thinking about anthropology and getting into curriculum earlier. And I'll just say that I'm on the anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. And we have a K through 12 initiative and have some funding from Wenner-Gren. And what we're doing right now is just looking at the New York State sort of standards. And we're identifying the places in those standards that speak directly to what we do, but it's being called something, it's just not being called anthropology, right? So they're looking at culture change and they're looking at global processes and interconnections and so forth. And so what we're doing is developing curricula that then we're going to pilot in partnership with teachers in elementary schools in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens. And so, I invite anybody who's interested in sort of being a part of that and using the model that we're developing to join us. So feel free to come and talk to me.
That's very good to know. I did not know that. I mean, I'm familiar with the AAS. I've given talks down there sometimes. I didn't know anything about that. That's good. What troubles me is that why isn't anthropology in the name? I think we are very bad at promoting ourselves. I learned this. Thank you. Yeah. I learned this at the World Bank when I worked with a whole bunch of economists. And, not to say anything bad about the economists, I don't. But on the other hand, they're very good at telling people about economics. And we're not. And when something happens that we were directly involved with, or when something doesn't happen that we could have avoided had we been asked in the first place, nobody says, well, you needed an anthropologist. I mean, we say that to each other, but we're not very good at promoting it. There's a sort of a whole political economy of disciplines in the world, and we're just not a player. So it would be nice if we could get anthropology into the curriculum. I've been involved in education efforts that have been called global studies. I can tell you it's not anthropology. I mean, it's got elements of anthropology in it, but it could be so much better if it were centered somewhere, if you see what I mean. Anyway, that's another topic. Thank you for that.
Hello. I just want to start by saying thank you for all of this today. It's definitely opened my mind to a lot of things. But my question is, as an undergrad, a lot of change can happen from the student side of things. Like I've been hearing from like how practitioners could change and faculty can change stuff. But how would you, if you have any ideas, how would you go about like introducing this alternative branch or this fifth branch from a student's perspective? Like, how would you communicate that to faculty or even into your department or anything like that? How would you like introduce it or advocate like practitioner anthropology into a department?
Or into a department.
Yeah.
As a student.
As a
Yeah.
student. This is probably one of the things, if you will get in touch with me and Elizabeth later on in the day or sometime over the weekend, we would invite you to work with us on figuring out. Because this whole first year of our work was figuring out what some of the issues were. And now we're faced with the very difficult task of, okay, what do we do now? And there are lots of more things we could do. This is probably one of them, but we need to keep the focus on practitioners. Students are the ultimate client for us, if you want to put it that way. I mean, we have to figure that out. But these are not easy issues to deal with. My approach is to sort of put a basket of goodies out on the floor and see who comes forward to pick them up. In other words, I'm not interested until to try and talk a department into doing it. I could care less. They've got their own reasons for what they do, and there's a whole bunch of, it's like talking about why Congress should be different than it is. I'm interested in the individual senator or representative. I want to change their mind. I want to show them another way to look at something, which doesn't violate them as a person, doesn't diminish them, but sort of says you can do something different. You can do that if you want. We think, Elizabeth and I think, I should not speak for anybody, I think you're right. We think there are a lot of instructors out there who would very much like to teach their students about practice and about application and about all the different ways that could work, but they don't quite know how to do that yet. And so they are understandably very reluctant to get into something where they're not an expert, because after all, their PhD work made them into an expert. And now they're getting off into something, and many of them very frankly, it's like, I don't know anything about that. I don't feel that it's ethical for me to teach that. So we're going to change that. We're going to say, here's some resources. Here's some things you can use in the classroom, which, as Jillian said, the dominoes, takes something they already know and says, now, let's move it over here. And you can do this. So that's what we're looking for. Your specific things. Join us and we will work with you.
Yeah, thank you. We've heard a great deal of interesting conversation today. We're so grateful. One of the things that I just wanted to bring to the floor here as someone who's new to this conversation, I really appreciate the work that CRC is doing and has been doing to collect this information. It's extremely useful. I'm coming from the academic side of things. I'm coming from the pedagogical side of things. I'm coming as someone who is working closely with undergraduates specifically who are very eager, enterprising, and serious about finding futures through anthropology, right, into a professional future. And I guess, I have less, I don't have a question. I have a comment, which is that, I appreciate your recognizing or acknowledging the way that theory and academics go together with practice. And I simply want to bring to the floor the fact that from the standpoint of faculty who are especially working with undergrads, this is what's happening in academia right now. And we are actively working to bring these opportunities, transparency about anthropological expertise to our students, right? And so I would also just ask for a bit of temperance maybe when we talk about like academics being out of touch or academics, only being focused on theory and so on and so forth. For some of them, that is true. Many of us who are here today are actively working to create synergies and connections that will be fruitful for our students into the future. And so, I want you guys to know that we're here and we're doing that. Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to add a couple of things. We see this, and that's one of the reasons I said there are some people out there in the academy trying actively working. So what we're proposing is not to sort of change course, but rather accelerate a process that's already in place. But the other thing you touched on at the very beginning of your remark is something that I just want to say a word about. Pedagogy. None of us, unless you went through an education program, were ever trained to be teachers. We learned it, that's why I said it's a craft. Okay. How we teach people about practice is probably going to be a little bit different from the way we have taught people about theory. I'm not really sure. I don't have a clear idea. I think that's what's going to happen. We need to figure out different ways of teaching students about theory. I take this from my experience of 20 years as an associate provost of international programs at various state universities, where I kind of internationalized the campus and sending people abroad and study abroad, year abroad, semester abroad, research abroad, whatever. And most of that is concerned with logistics. Buying airline tickets, booking hotels, getting classrooms. Very little of it involves teaching students how to learn about cultural difference. And I think that we have a similar problem with practice. We need to pay attention to that. And I count on our instructors, the faculty members, to figure that out, because that's coming. So, one more question.
Okay, I'll try to.
We're all standing between you and
I'll try to keep this brief. I also teach undergraduates, so everything that you just said. It occurs to me, I teach in a joint sociology anthropology department, and it occurs to me, I've heard many conversations like the ones we've been having today amongst anthropologists about our professional identity and the extent to which we should be more involved in practice. I don't think I've ever heard my sociological colleagues have those debates. It seems like whatever it was, they settled it. And I wonder if other people have similar experiences, or if there are lessons we can learn from sociology. Maybe our kind of sibling discipline has already figured out some of these problems.
I think the schools do not have an insecurity complex about just anthropology.
Yeah, no, as I said before, if you've got a problem, figure out who else has got the problem and how to solve it. And so you would look through, I cited psychology, and very sort of two places where I go for reading psychology and work with them. And I understand how they're educated and what they do with what they learn. Sociology could very well be. Lots of disciplines have solved this problem. We have, and to my colleague over there, we're the ones that seem to sort of make heavy weather of this. We need to sort of poke our head up outside the ground pot hole and look around and figure out what other people have done and what can we learn from them. It's not a big problem. It's just a problem that we need to want to solve. Anyway, thank you. You've been a great audience. I appreciate it.